US President Donald Trump rejected the NATO partners' proposal to help with the situation around the Hormuz Strait. Now that the situation in the Hormuz Strait has been resolved, I received a call from NATO asking if we needed any help. I told them to stay out of it unless they just want to load their ships with oil. They were useless when they were needed. Paper tigers, he wrote on April 17th on True Social. This is not the first time the American president has criticized the alliance. In early April, Trump stated that he was seriously considering ending his country's membership in NATO because Washington's allies refused to support the US and Israel in their war against Iran. At the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Washington would reconsider its relationship with the alliance after the war. Against this backdrop, according to the Wall Street Journal, European countries, together with Canada, are discussing the creation of a European NATO. In addition, under Germany's leadership, they have begun to develop a plan for Europe's defense without the US. The publications coincided with the European tour of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who this week visited Germany, Italy, Norway, and the Netherlands. Let's talk about the future of NATO right now with our first guest. Joining us now is journalist and international observer Alexei Pichi. Alexei, hello. First question. How justified are Trump's complaints about European partners and allies? After all, European countries can respond with two counter-arguments. First, they can say that we are dealing with the war in Ukraine because the US is currently not providing any assistance. And second, they can say that we weren't even informed about the upcoming operation in Iran. Why should we help, really?
You know, I would have commented a lot on this situation already, but in this context, especially considering Donald Trump's latest statement, I would look at this story from a political strategy point of view. Because very often all of Donald Trump's criticism towards NATO partners, it seems to me, is mostly aimed at the domestic audience. At that very mega movement which began to criticize Donald Trump quite strongly, who after all promised isolationism, promised to focus exclusively on domestic American problems and not on wars around the world. Accordingly, now Donald Trump is trying to show voters that, you see, I really don't want to spend huge amounts of money to protect Europe. On the other hand, Donald Trump understands very well what processes are taking place in Europe. And we really see a parallel process when the United Kingdom, Germany, and France basically take the lead and form their own coalition, which one way or another will still participate in operations to ensure security in the Hormuz Strait, but after the end of the war. That is, it is obvious that the European countries are not going to enter the war itself, but after the war they will, in any case, be forced to get involved, specifically regarding security. And then the American president can say, see, I told you that sooner or later they would get involved anyway, and here they are, they got involved after all. So my pressure, you see, kind of produced results. And on the other hand, if we speak purely in legal terms, there are two key articles in the NATO Charter that everyone talks about. That's Article 4 and Article 5. And Article 4, well, Donald Trump could have used it any day during all these 1.5 months of war in the Middle East, but he didn't use it. If you remember, when unknown drones started flying over Poland, Poland actually activated Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which is about consultations. That means they don't obligate anyone to anything yet. But it's an appropriate step when you need to sit down with your allies and consult about what to do. What Poland could count on in this situation, Donald Trump could have done the same, but he didn't request any consultations. I'm not even mentioning Article 5, where supposedly everyone should have stepped in and, together with Donald Trump, gone to war against Iran. So, legally and officially, Donald Trump did not turn to the North Atlantic Alliance for help at all. And what he declares publicly as the President of the United States doesn't carry much legal weight, especially in the context of consultations with the North Atlantic Alliance. That's why everything that happens publicly, you know, I would take with a big grain of salt at least 5 times over, especially what the American president says, because very often his statements differ greatly from what actually happens in reality. And in reality, let's be open and honest, European countries are involved in a war against Iran because there are military bases in European countries that American soldiers actively use. These include Eastern European countries, the German base, bases in Cyprus, British bases, and so on. That is, planes take off from somewhere, refueling aircraft lands somewhere, and American aviation is serviced somewhere. And it's serviced not only at bases in the Middle East, like in Jordan and so on. And all this aviation is serviced at European bases. So when Trump says they're not helping, that's a lie. That's not true. Moreover, the UK and Germany hold consultations with the Gulf countries. So obviously, and I'll finish my thought here, it's clear that after the war ends, European countries will take part in ensuring the security of the Hormuz Strait. That's why I believe all of Trump's statements are absolutely unfounded. But still, let's consider who they're addressed to. Are they addressed to Europeans? I don't think so. It's more likely aimed exclusively at a purely domestic electoral audience.
That's a fair point about Trump's statements. We've already learned over this past year or so that we shouldn't take them literally. But that's why, in this regard, I think the statements made by Secretary of State Marco Rubio about reconsidering relations after the war are much more significant and worth paying attention to.
Relations will be reconsidered regardless. Let's go back. Thanks for mentioning Marco Rubio. I always remember this. Back during Donald Trump's 2024 election campaign, Marco Rubio was the first to officially state that they are completely changing the United States of America's defense strategy. And this is absolutely not news. And I would also like to draw attention to a recent statement by Elbridge Colby. He is the US Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy. He is quite a controversial figure. In Ukraine, he is not very well liked because he was essentially the person who pushed Pete Hegseth, for example, at the beginning of last year to limit intelligence sharing with Ukraine, if you remember. The same thing happened again in August. So Elbridge Colby spoke a lot recently at the Ramstein format meeting about the so-called NATO 3.0, if you've heard of it. The Americans actively promoted this strategy under the Trump administration, with Marco Rubio first mentioning it during the election campaign. And this strategy is about the fact that the Americans, let's put it this way, after the Cold War, they understand perfectly well that the main theater of operations in terms of geopolitics is no longer in Europe, well, from their point of view. Let's look at the situation now from the point of view of American interests. That is, from their perspective, the main theater of operations is not in Europe. It's more likely in Asia, where there is confrontation with China. Accordingly, they are trying to shift all their efforts in that direction, but at the same time, they can't just leave Europe alone with the problem called Russia. Accordingly, the idea is that Europe takes responsibility for the continent's defense in terms of conventional warfare. That is, it takes responsibility for the main armaments itself. And that's exactly what Elbridge Colby was talking about. Here's the point. When we hear these statements that Europe should defend itself from the mouths of Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and so on, we all think that this is the Americans signaling that they're dropping everything and leaving. No, they're not leaving. Elbridge Colby clearly stated that Europe should develop its own defense industry, its own weapons, its own army, and so on and so on. And America will stay in NATO. That's an interesting point. It will stay. It's not going anywhere. It will just slightly change its role. And now Europeans are also taking over certain areas of command within the North Atlantic Alliance. As for the European theater of military operations, Europeans are restructuring their military-industrial base. And the Americans will still share technology, intelligence data, and so on. And in addition, there's something else to pay attention to when it comes to reassessing relations. Pay attention to who criticizes the Trump administration's statements the most regarding the withdrawal of American troops from Europe or reassessing relations. Or when Trump says he'll pull out of NATO and won't provide protection. Mostly, it's the countries of Western Europe. If we look at the statements from Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, Finland, Poland, Romania, then we'll see that the statements here are a bit different. And usually Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who openly says that he doesn't criticize Donald Trump as actively. Why? Because if we look at this NATO 3.0 strategy, which the Trump administration is promoting, we'll see that it clearly states that there will be a redeployment. That is, American troops remain in Europe, but they are moving from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. You may have heard there were even some insider reports in the American press recently saying that Trump wants to punish European countries for not joining the war against Iran by moving troops. So he is moving troops specifically from Western Europe to Greece, Poland, and the Baltic countries. That is, to the eastern flank. And the idea is that Europe really should defend itself. But it also needs to understand that its main line of defense in any future conflict, it's the eastern flank, not the western one. And all efforts are focused on the eastern flank. The Americans remain, but they don't cover the eastern flank. And at the same time, they urge Europe to arm itself. And why is the percentage of GDP that countries must spend on defense increasing? Precisely so that these countries can, on their own, expand their defense industrial complex. And eventually, after some time, they can fully supply themselves with weapons. In this context, Ukraine is now also acting as a driving force. It's just that when Zelensky goes and signs all these defense agreements with the Europeans, that's it. And when, for example, some, like Keith Kellogg, have said this, American officials are talking about the need to form some kind of new alliance to replace NATO. There will be no replacement for NATO as it seems to me and as I see it. There will simply be a real restructuring of the North Atlantic Alliance. The Americans will just shift their focus to Asia. But that definitely doesn't mean they're leaving Europe. They will just be less involved.
Alexei, one last question. How do you see the prospects for Europe itself being restructured in this sense, in terms of restructuring its defenses? When again we see the proposal from the European Commissioner for Defense, the representative from Eastern Europe, Andrius Kubilius, about the need for a united European army of 100,000. In response, we hear skepticism, mostly from Western European countries. Where are we going to get these 100,000? The European Union has 450 million people, yet they're questioning how to find 100,000 for the army.
Let's be honest, old Europe has always been slow, it's always been indecisive. It seems to me for one simple reason. After World War II, even before the creation of the North Atlantic Alliance, the Americans made it clear that they would protect us. We will not allow Germany to rise again after World War II and start another war in Europe. You just develop, build your economy, your prosperity, and so on. Europe has become completely used to this, and that should also be taken into account. When the Americans criticize the Europeans for not developing quickly enough, well, the Americans themselves, let's put it this way, have trained them to do this. I think that sooner or later the Europeans will come to this, they will be forced to. And just to illustrate how slowly this is happening, I always remind people of Emmanuel Macron's statement. If I'm not mistaken, this was back in 2017 or 2018 when he was loudly proclaiming everywhere that strategic autonomy was needed. Europe must not be dependent on either the US or China. It needs to build a European army and so on and so forth. So Macron was saying this almost 10 years ago, and only now have they finally started discussing it at the European Union level. But on the other hand, credit should be given where it's due. Now, in the European Union, they have finally remembered that Article 42, paragraph 7 of the treaty establishing the EU is about mutual defense. And it outlines exactly the same mechanisms. If someone attacks one of the EU countries, all the other EU countries must come to that country's defense. No one ever talked about this, but it turns out there is such an article. And now they have finally started working out the response mechanisms in case one of the countries activates this Article 42 of the EU treaty. That's why I think Europe is moving in the right direction. Slowly, not as fast as we would probably like. But it will have to do it because America also won't sit and wait for long until Europe finally overhauls its own defense.
Thank you, Alexei Pecci, for joining us as an international affairs commentator and journalist. Goodbye.
And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would be grateful to you for that. You can do this through donations, sponsorship on YouTube, or a paid subscription, for example, on the Patreon platform. All the links and details are in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone. To be continued.